Well, welcome to another conversation. And today I have somebody really special with us. His name is Father Rod Barr, and you probably know him as, that religious guy who's sticking up signs on his church. Remember when we had the vote about gay marriages? Well, he was right in there. He's been right in there around refugees and asylum seekers. We're going to talk to him about his perspective. So welcome, Rod.
Thank you very much.
So why don't you tell us, I believe, and I've read your book, everybody, if you haven't read it, it's called Outspoken. What is a butcher son, wasn't it? Is that your background?
Oh, yes, and a butcher myself.
Were you?
Trade,
so
yes.
how did you end up running a very large social media presence, talking about social justice, and to some degree being a bit of a moral conscience for us all?
It was a long journey, of course, from being a butcher to a priest initially, and that's a long story too in terms of that calling to into the priestly ministry. But it took a long time from that point. I mean, I guess the church is a very conservative organisation, and I initially was quite a conservative priest in many ways, but. For me, the study of the life and teaching of that nomadic rabbi of 2,000 years ago sort of really got into my soul eventually, and I started to see things from a different perspective in terms of social justice and of human rights, and therefore became quite passionate about that. And I had this old plastic sign down the front of the church that I started to use, and it was just, I guess, made for the moment in terms of the meme communications that started to happen around Twitter and social media. So it was a bit of an old school sign that fitted perfectly into the new meme technology.
So why don't you just take us through what actually happened? Where did you get that thought? Because it actually said, "Dear Christians, some people are gay. Get over it. Love God." Where did that come from?
That was the first big one. And I'd been invited by this man's sister to come and anoint him. He was dying. He was dying at home. So they had a hospital bed set up in the lounge room. And I asked his sister, he was unconscious. I asked his sister if he lived alone. And she was a bit embarrassed about sort of telling me that he had a male partner. And it deeply affected me, and I wanted to say to my local community initially that we are an inclusive church, and we don't care whether you're gay or straight or anything else for that matter. And so I came back that very moment. I drove back to the church and put up that sign, and of course it just went crazy, went viral. Some estimates now there's been sort of over 50 million hits on that particular. Yes. Yeah.
So did you hide in your office? Did you put the sign up and go, "Oh gosh, I don't know what's going to happen"?
No, it never occurred to me. It never occurred to me that anything would happen other than the people would drive past and either agree or disagree, and that was it. And so within hours, it had gone to thousands, and within days to tens of thousands, and then the media got interested, and I had no training whatsoever in that area, and so it was all a bit difficult for a while. And I thought, oh, this will all just disappear after a couple of days, and of course here we are, some nearly 7 years later. Still doing media.
So what did the church leadership say when this all happened? Did they get a shock? Because you must have been a bit of a rebel.
The bishop, my bishop of the time, was a man who it was quite difficult in some ways, but he had a real passion for what was just.
Yeah.
And so he was very encouraging, and the succession of bishops I've had since then have all been people who have had a real passion for social justice. And while they may not always be totally comfortable with the way I go about things, they really passionately believe that we should be involved in these conversations.
Well, it certainly makes the church very relevant and progressive, which is what most of us want to see the church doing. What other campaigns have you looked at since that period of time? And I guess I need to backtrack a bit. How did your church community, how did your parishioners feel about all of this with all the overnight attention?
Well, by that stage, I'd been here for 13 or 14 years. I've been here for 20 years now. And so there was a long run up to that. I mean, I'd been preaching and teaching around social justice issues for a long time. And so the bulk of people in the parish were just another step in that direction as far as they were concerned. One or two got a little bit upset, one or two left. Most of whom have come back now. We had one guy, he was in his 90s, and he just said, look, I can't cope with this. I'm going to go to the parish next door. And I said, look, I get that. That's okay. Interestingly, he came back 3 years later, and the week after he came back, we have a who's had a birthday, any blessings sort of thing at the end of church, and he came up and asked me to say a prayer of blessing for his niece, who was getting married to her same-sex partner that weekend in Melbourne. So, that was interesting. And, it wasn't my argument that changed his mind. It was the fact that someone he loved and cared for was getting married to the person she loved. And that's what changed his mind. So, the parish has flourished in that sense because our messaging is one of inclusiveness, and I think that's what people are really aching for at the moment is inclusion in an increasingly polarised world, which is very exclusive. That polarisation and that we experience politically at the moment. That's a very exclusive thing. You're either in or you're out. It depends on which side you're on, and people ache for inclusion and connection.
Yeah, absolutely. So the sorts of things you stand for as a community around social justice, are there things near to your heart, or are there issues that you feel need amplifying?
Well, interestingly, when we realised that we had a platform, it took us a while to kind of get what was going on. So we started to ask, okay, we've got a platform here, and some form of notoriety. Bono said that fame was currency, and it's important to really reflect on how you spend your currency. So that's what we did, and we realised that we couldn't do everything, and so we chose three things. There's a passage in one of the prophets in the Hebrew scriptures: to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. And so we decided we would attach three things to that, and the justice issue at the time was marriage equality debate, because we felt that everybody should live in the same civic universe, and clearly at that stage people didn't. And so we campaigned quite heavily for that justice issue. To love mercy was the refugee issue, because we felt that not only did refugees not live in the same civic universe, but they didn't live in the same universe as we did. And so we lobbied government and tried to sort of personally care for a number of refugees, some of whom came and spent time in our home, and to walk humbly. Well, the Latin word humus is where we get our word humble from, but it also means earth. And so the care for the earth. So they were the three things that we focused on over that time and continue to do. We've just only in recent weeks, through a whole process, come to a point where we're able to offer people in same-sex marriages a blessing. And so we're slowly but surely, the church takes hundreds of years to change anything, but we're slowly but surely working our way in that direction. And so to love mercy and to seek justice and walk humbly continue to be the things that guide us.
So you say that climate change obviously is one of the platforms that you're working towards. Has this year sort of stifled that a bit because there's been so much focus on COVID and everyone's lived in a mark time universe, really?
Well, on one level, yes, it has, and we've taken a bit of a step back this year and taken a breath as well. I think when you eventually stop, you realise how busy you've been, and that was good. But I think we will find that the pandemic will highlight the issue of the way we interact with our environment in terms of climate, because there's some fairly credible science now that's beginning to say that, you know, part of this pandemic comes from the fact that of deforestation and us, you know, taking, you know, a lot of habitat away from animals that we wouldn't normally interact with. And yeah, so I think even the pandemic has a climate issue wrapped around it. And so, you know, at the end of the day, if we don't get this one right, it doesn't matter what else we get right.
Well, I totally agree. We do a lot of preventive work, particularly around self-care. And I deliberately put a plinth in there called Planet Self-Care, because if we don't look after the planet, we don't have anything. That's the bottom line.
No, we can be as passionate as we like about refugees and gay marriage, but if we haven't got a planet to live on, then it's not going to matter.
Yeah.
And of course, it's the most vulnerable that suffer first in climate change. I mean, it's all right for us; we're rich and we've got air-conditioned houses and jobs, but you know, there'll be more, and there are 60 million displaced persons in the world today. And they're mostly displaced by war or civil unrest, but what will come is those being displaced by climate change. Bangladesh is, you know, only 1.3 metres above sea level at the best of times, and
absolutely.
So there's 20 million people there coming our way unless we can find a way to mitigate climate change.
I wanted to ask you about adversity because, I think you and I probably have a lot in common. The commonality of stories of people is usually around adversity, the struggles they've been through, and the big learning lesson of life, that it often is around suffering, and how you get through that. Do you think we're not prepared adequately for the journey of life, what lays ahead of us? Because when we're young, the world's our oyster, and then all these things come at you, and if you haven't been through childhood trauma, it's going to hit you somewhere along the lines. Do you think there's a role for us to play in helping people to understand that and learn about it?
Yeah, I mean, spirituality above all. I mean, there's a definition of contemplation as much reality as you can handle. And I think,
True.
You know, and I think we've grown up in a sweet spot of human history, really, that post-war economic boom, flourishing of science, of medical, in particular medical science, and my children are now in their late 30s. You know, they've grown up in a time where adversity wasn't actually expected. I think at every other time in human history, people grow up, you know, or live with an expectation of adversity. And in the post-war Western world, there was an expectation there wouldn't be any adversity.
Yeah.
And so when it inevitably comes, it's a bit of a shock to the system. And I find often people who encounter adversity encounter it as almost an injustice, that this isn't fair. Life's not supposed to be like this. And I think that's a modernist and particularly a postmodern phenomena, that people aren't necessarily programmed to engage in adversity, and then of course you get new phenomena in some sense, especially the post-traumatic stress, and I'm sure that's always been part of the human condition. But I think you place that into a context where adversity is not considered to be part of the normal process of life, and it seems to be amplified.
Yeah, I've noticed it particularly with our communities, like particularly younger people, that they have their financial plans in order with life stages. The financial planners have hijacked life, and, you get your first car, and you buy your first home, and then, all these life stages. But there's not a lot of discussion around bad things happen,
Yeah.
and it comes at you. And how are you going to, what tools do you have to help you through those? Who can you reach out? Do you need a deeper connection? What are those things? If you've got a percentage of your parishioners, I suppose, that have thought about that, particularly younger people?
I find not so much. I mean, we've got some, a broad range of age groups in our community, and we've got people who are pre-war, and I was talking to a woman the other day who was remembering the bombing of London when she was a kid, and so there are generations who grew up in that sense of engaging adversity. I mean, whilst I'm the late baby boomer in that sense, I grew up in the country. Where the next drought was always around the corner, so you planned for adversity. And my kids still laugh at me when I say this, because I keep saying you need to plan for the next drought. You've got to put the money away. You've got to, and they'll sort of laugh at me about that. And but I still, in my psyche, I still plan for the next drought, or plan for adversity, and sometimes as I look back over my journey now, I think I've probably focused too much on that at some times in my life, and so there's a healthy balance, and I think it can't be something that totally dominates your psyche. Otherwise, you'll just live in a state of constant anxiety. And so there's a balance between bad things can happen. I'm not going to live my life totally dominated by that thought, but I'm going to plan for
it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so when it does happen, I've got some resources there to deal with it, and I'm going to put that aside and live my life to the most fullest extent I can. When the wheels fall off, I'll have something there to prop myself up.
Yeah. So tell me, Rod, how did your book come about? Because, for an Anglican priest to write a book is a pretty big thing.
Well, basically, the publisher approached me and said,
Did they?
Here's the money, write a book.
That's good.
But as we went, I wanted to... the book's really in two parts in that sense. Something of my personal story. You never tell the whole part of your personal story.
No, you tell what you want everyone to know. Yeah.
There are people still alive.
Yeah.
But it is a story that engages some adversity, and I don't think I probably filled it out as much as I would have liked to have in hindsight. But I share a story with 175,000 other Australians who, between 1956 and 1965, were adopted, and within that group of people, there's a extraordinarily high incidence of addiction, family breakdown, suicide, self-harm, and so there's, I think, a lot more work to be done in that space yet. Whether I'll ever get around to doing more.
Well, it's an important space because it's your identity, it's belonging, isn't it? It's all of those things. And if you don't have that anchor, then you can wander through life not really knowing who you are.
Yes, well, that's certainly part of my story.
Yeah.
And even, people say, what attracted you to the priesthood? Well, the easy answer to that is identity.
Mm.
It came with a uniform.
It's a package deal.
Package deal. Yeah, you get a title and a uniform and a place in society ready made where you just slot into it in every town and village in the country. And so it's that for adopted people there is that search for identity that I'm a little bit lucky in some ways. Has found something that worked for me, whereas a lot of people don't.
So when you did find, I mean, you obviously found faith and had a calling and all of that. When you did find that, was it like clunk, I belong? Is that how it felt for you?
Oh, initially, but of course, I learnt, as I think everybody does, who take on some form of identity, like you might put on some clothes or a uniform, discover that identity, your true identity, can only come from within.
Yeah. And
so it took a while for me to realise that, hang about, this doesn't quite work as well as I thought it would, and that I had some deep inner searching and coming to know myself in that way was the only way for me to find an identity. So, but it was part of the, learning that is part of the journey.
And I think that's the thing, we're all on a journey, and sometimes the people that we think have got it all together actually are having a harder time than most.
Well, I mean, I guess I live my life, looking behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And I've very much learnt that and people look for identity in all sorts of ways, in wealth, in position, in possessions, and of course none of it really works.
So I'm asking you because of the social justice platform, but at the moment in Australia, the really troubling thing is the level of corporate corruption that we're hearing about just everywhere. I mean, for a while, there hasn't been any room on the front page of our papers. It's just been extraordinary. And it's almost as though we've lost our way in terms of morality of who we are, the soul of Australia. Is that coming up in some of your conversations?
It comes up in simply in the way that we interact with the world around us. I mean, we have wealth drives or money drives so much of our culture in the West, and it's corrupted our corporate or company life to the point where the only allegiance a corporation has is to the shareholder and providing profit for the shareholder. And we went through a stage where there was no idea that there was some kind of societal responsibility as well. And I think that is changing. You have a number of companies now who have ethical investment issues, and even mining companies now are looking at how they reduce their carbon footprint. And so I think that is changing. But when you have something as powerful as business driving a culture of essentially individualism, so it's the individual shareholder who was the absolute focus of the whole activity, the whole business activity. It's a road to destruction on every level. But I think society is starting to ask some questions around that and saying that's not the only indicator of success.
Yes.
That being good corporate citizens is another indicator of success. And people will invest in good corporate citizenship. And I think now that, especially around some of the climate stuff, I mean, the big banks just won't invest in coal anymore. Not just because it's unethical, but it's actually a bad investment now. It's a bad investment because it's unethical. And so there's a shift. And I think religious voices in that space can be, if they're exercised well and with sensitivity and with wisdom, can be part of that movement towards a more ethical corporate life.
Which leads me to a very hard question. The church has come under so much scrutiny for how we've treated children, and rightly so, and it's been hidden for so long. Do you think it'll ever heal? Because, you know, in my conversations, so many people are hurt and it's turned them off for life. Like they're just angry. You know, have we done enough? What can be done?
I'm part of the Anglican Diocese of Newcastle, which was case study 42 of the Royal.
Yes, I know.
And we were so fortunate at the time to have had a bishop at the time who was himself a survivor, and he enabled us to see the whole thing from the perspective of the survivor rather than the perspective of the institution. And it totally transformed the way we looked at things. And you know, being institutionalised myself for all of those many years, it was quite a shift. And I remember Joanne McCarthy, who was the journalist who effectively created the Royal Commission, and she was reporting around some of these things in the Maitland-Newcastle area, and eventually with the detective Peter Fox, went to Julia Gillard, and we had the Royal Commission. I was speaking with Joanne McCarthy at a refugee rally at Newcastle University, and it was focusing around the welfare of children on Nauru. And Joanne stood up and said, you know, had Rod's bishop not behaved in the way he has, Rod would have no credibility speaking about the plight of children. But because the Diocese of Newcastle have been open and honest and pledged proper redress and proper justice, that then gives us a foundation on which we can have some kind of moral voice. Had we not done that, then we would have no right to speak on any moral or ethical issue, to be honest. And so it's been quite a journey for us. And I knew a lot of those priests who back in the 70s and 60s, 70s and 80s had behaved in such abominable fashion and created so much pain and suffering for so many people. And so it's been a difficult personal journey for me. And some of those priests were my heroes. And so it's been the death of heroes for me, and really recalibrating myself as an institutionalised person to be committed to be a survivor focused.
That's really interesting, because one of my platforms has been supporting people in the workers' compensation system. And, you know, there's so many people that have been so badly hurt by a very broken system. And it's been very under the radar for so long. And the common denominator with everything is lived experience. If you do not give lived experience people a voice, the pain will last. It will fester. It will never get better.
No, but that kind of experience changes your DNA.
Yes.
And with some help and a little bit of luck, sometimes you can learn to live as that new being.
Yeah.
But you never get over it in that sense.
No, I'm actually really encouraged though, in conversations quite often people will say, I'm a survivor. They'll volunteer it now. And that's a good thing, because they're inviting you to have a conversation sometimes around it, to share their story, to listen. And it's really important for us to be present when someone wants to tell you that. Have you found that similar sort of?
Yeah. Oh, yes. I mean, I guess because I've been in this diocese all my life and a priest in this diocese for 30 years, And because I knew some of those people, some of the survivors of their abuse have approached me, and they really want, because most of those abusers are dead or in jail, they kind of wanted me to hear their story, and in almost like they were talking to their abusers, because I knew their abuser.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's kind of receiving that story without comment or judgment. It can be a very healing thing.
I think they call it the ministry of presence, don't they?
Yes, it is. And while I certainly can't, I hesitate to use either the word victim or survivor about myself. There was one of these particular abusers who tried to abuse me, didn't get away with it, but he was so powerful that because he didn't get away with it, then blocked every promotion that I was offered. And so, so it's not only personal abuse, but institutional abuse as well.
Yeah, I agree. So with all of this happening over a period, did you say you've been there for 20 odd years?
I've been a priest in the diocese nearly 30 years.
Okay. So what are some of the good things? I mean, I know you were nominated for a Human Rights Medal, which is a wonderful acknowledgement. What are some of the good things that have come from having a platform, not necessarily for you, but for everybody that is walking this path?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that have come out of this for me is that people do have a spirituality. I would say, everybody has a spirituality.
I think they do.
And the church has been such an exclusive institution that it's kind of blocked a lot of people exploring that. And I think so. What we've come to in recent times, and I guess in my particular experience of ministry here in Gosford, has been opening up some of those conversations with people that we may not have been able to have conversations with before, and opening them up in an inclusive, again, non-judgmental way, and recognising that, okay, everybody's on a journey, and they may not use the same language as I use, or appreciate some of the the symbols I appreciate, but they'll have their own symbols, their own language, and it's tuning our ears to appreciate the language that they're using and learn to speak that language in some way so that there can be a conversation. And I think that, for me, has been one of the great privileges and joys and advantages of that particular part of my journey.
Well, you've just stolen my question, because I was going to say, what does spirituality mean to you? But
well, I think what spirituality means for me, spirituality is the way in which we engage the more in our daily lives, and so if we look at things through our spirituality, we'll be going about our daily lives and work and play and relationships and whatever. But there's always more to what's going on than immediately meets our experience. And engaging beyond that point is what I would call spirituality.
Fascinating. Because people do get confused with spirituality and religion and faith.
Yes.
Like they go, oh, and you have to have, well, everyone's got spirituality. Everyone, it's part of being human.
Yes. And I mean, organised religion at its best, which is rare, but at its best, does enable, it is a tool to create the pathway for us to engage the more intentionally and in a deeper way. That's at its best, that's what it does. At its worst, of course, it blocks that journey completely.
So my last question is around self-care, because doing what you do, Rod, and everyone for that matter, and we've certainly all learnt it in COVID, unless we look after ourselves, we aren't capable of helping those around us. And it's for those helping professionals, it can be very challenging. How do you look after yourself? How do you practice self-care? Are you good at it?
I am the worst person in the world to ask this question. Although I'm 58 this year, so it's probably taken me that long, and I think the pandemic to really make me look at that question. And my life was crazy. I mean, I was never off a plane or out of a hotel room, for the last 10 years. And I didn't realise that I wasn't looking after myself. I didn't realise I was just on the hamster wheel. And then when everything stopped so suddenly, all of a sudden I had this whole year of engagements planned, and everything got cancelled. And the church was shut, and phones stopped ringing, and it was then that I just realised how extraordinarily busy I'd been, and I was forced to stay at home, and I thought, well, what am I going to do? And I started gardening, and rebuilt our gardens, and started growing veggies, and got a couple of chooks, and so I'm getting, I think for the first time in my working life, determined not to go back to the way I was.
You're not the only one that says that. People talk a lot about once they got over the sudden shock of the busyness, they've actually really got into the stillness.
Absolutely, yeah. And I was just saying to a colleague today that I was determined not to get busy again, but I'm starting to. And I've got to be more disciplined about what I do and what I choose to do, because there's some things I'm really interested in, I want to do, but I have to learn to say no to some of the things I want to do. Otherwise, I'll just get back onto the treadmill again. And so I'm quite determined to start having my days off and doing some of these things.
So you've sort of observed the way your life was, and are saying, okay, I can do it a bit differently.
I can do this differently, yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.